talking about choices that we've made. Help us unpack a little bit the 400 years of choices that have been made around slavery, Jim Crow, biases, and the impact that that's had on institutions like education, housing, healthcare, economic empowerment, particularly given you're looking at not just this location, but other locations here in the South and elsewhere that were huge economic engines that the African slave did not participate in to the same degree that the slaveholder did, even though that wealth was being generated and created. Help us understand a little bit and contextualize some of those choices by both Black and white individuals in sort of creating this new landscape in America.
Yeah. Well, certainly before 1865, the greatest source of wealth in the nation was enslaved African people, enslaved African Americans. I mean, that's where America's wealth was. And so when we think about that for the first, 250 years of this nation, of the 4 million or so enslaved folk in the South by that time, they are excluded from that wealth, obviously. So what happens at the moment of emancipation? And you mentioned choices. I do think it's important. We often celebrate the founders for making the radical choice to break away from England. But then, too often, we give them a pass on not making the radical choice to break away from slavery. What happened to that spirit when it came to that? But in 1865, we have this moment of emancipation when we're talking about wealth. Enslaved African Americans received their freedom with nothing but the tattered clothes on their backs and the bonds of love that they have between one another that help them survive and endure this Holocaust of slavery. There is no compensation. There is no reparations. Now, DC is a little different because there is some compensation, but it ain't for the Black folk. It's for the enslavers. So it's not like we don't have a history of compensation. It's just not for those of us who needed it the most and deserved it the most. So the critical point is that at the moment of emancipation, enslaved African Americans are freed with nothing, nothing. And they're set off into this world. What do? Everybody has choices, but everybody has the same set of choices. And so in America, we know that wealth isn't just what one is able to generate during their lifetime. Wealth is what you are able to transfer from one generation to the next. And so when we look at wealth inheritance and wealth transfer from the generations, there's something that is particularly distinct about the African American experience. They enter into the society as equal citizens, put that in quotes, without anything. But then something amazing happens. They begin to accumulate wealth. They begin to build. They begin to purchase land. And we see this. By the time we hit 1900, 1890, 1900, 1910, is the moment in American history where African Americans own the most land that they ever will. Right at the turn of the century, which is also the height of the nadir, the height when you have 2 to 3 African Americans who are being publicly murdered every year. But what happens, and this is why the African American experience is also fundamentally different than many immigrant experiences, is that we see repeatedly that African Americans, despite the obstacles, are able to accumulate a modicum of wealth and then it's taken away. A series of racial pogroms, whether we're talking about Rosewood or Tulsa, Oklahoma, And this happens again and again. Forsyth County, Georgia, where African Americans are able to come together, build these institutions from nothing, and then they're robbed of it, and then they have to start over, not in the same place, but someplace else. The remarkable part of this story is they do it again. Part of the Great Migration, black folk losing their land, the wealth that they had accumulated, then moving out of the South and starting over. And then what happens if you move to a Detroit? Then you hit the Detroit racial massacre led by the police in 1843, the destruction of land and property. Wealth accumulation lost, African Americans having to start over. The story of Tulsa, Oklahoma, in which that black community is literally burned to the ground in 1921. That's not what destroys Tulsa, Black Wall Street. African Americans in Tulsa rebuild. What actually destroys Tulsa, rips the heart out of that community, is an interstate highway. Mm-hmm. Again, we talk about wealth. On a large scale, wealth is destroyed through displacement. We see it in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We see it in Philadelphia. We see it in New Orleans, Louisiana. That racial wealth gap that is so real does not exist because black folk haven't worked hard. Does not exist because black folk haven't valued education. Does not exist because black folk don't understand how to save. Nobody understands better how to save than poor people. They appreciate it. I got a grandmother who can attest to that. We often default back to that as an explanation, and we don't look at the systems and structures that prevent people from accumulating wealth over time. And then if you were to say nothing about sort of, the New Deal and the preferences for moving into suburbs and the like, if you were able, as an African American, to purchase a home by the time you get to the 60s or 70s, and were able to hold on to that home for 30 or 40 years, then what happens in 2008? Yeah. Mm-hmm. The largest, certainly for African Americans, we know as a whole that wealth, individual wealth, is mostly concentrated in home ownership. African Americans consistently denied access to home ownership. And then finally, these communities held together, owning their homes, and then you get that mortgage crisis in 2008. And that wealth disappears, vanishes. So, for me personally, a family coming out of slavery in Georgia, one side in Georgia, one side in Virginia, have a history of owning land, securing land. That land is lost, that land is taken away. Moving, family members moving up to Ohio, Great Migration, and then eventually over to New York and New Jersey. Grandparents who worked as, in dry cleaning and as a custodian. I mean, by the time for the Port Authority of New York, it wasn't until my parents purchased a home in 1980, that they held on to now, that increased in value exponentially in Brooklyn, New York, not during the first 20 years they owned it, when black people lived there, but during the next 20 years when white people moved in. Thank goodness for white people. And they're still alive, but when they pass on, 150 years after the moment of emancipation, that will be the first time in my family's history that there will be a significant transfer of wealth. 150 years later, that's how long it took. And that's not a unique story. And so when we think about what's the playing field, how do we level things out, we can't ignore that history, because the history explains what's possible. And certainly in America, in a capitalist society, that access to wealth and all the things that then become possible when you have access to wealth then become limited if you were African American, born here over the generations.